Well, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to Singapore, for those of you who have come from afar. And my thanks to the Middle East Institute for inviting me to share my thoughts with you this afternoon. I only hope that you will not conclude that it was an act of reckless folly on the part of Professor Hudson. And I say this not out of any sense of modesty, but because my ignorance, and I should say our ignorance of the Middle East in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Singapore government generally is so profound that we have only recently begun to plummet its depths. We have only recently begun to darkly glimpse what we do not know about the Middle East. And that is why we encourage the establishment of the Middle East Institute. And on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I must thank all of you who have made time to travel from very far away to help lead us out of our benighted state and set us on our first faltering steps towards enlightenment and understanding. Our serious engagement of the Middle East is rather recent. Of course, there have been ancient links between the Middle East and East and Southeast Asia going back many centuries. But they were just that, ancient. And it has been my experience that when diplomats begin to talk about ancient ties, it is generally only because they do not have very much to say about contemporary affairs. So I will not dwell on the past. It was in fact only 5 or 6 years ago that we in Singapore began to seriously engage the Middle East. Of course, our relations with all the Middle Eastern countries have always been friendly, or at least we endeavored to make them so, but they could hardly be considered or hardly be described as substantive. Our economic contacts were very largely energy related and conducted through the major international oil companies, while political contacts were confined to the occasional visit and working with each other when we needed each other's support in the UN and other multilateral institutions. If you will permit me a personal anecdote, I can best illustrate the previous state of our relationship with the Middle East if I tell you that my first assignment, more years ago than I care to admit, my first assignment when I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was as desk officer for the Middle East. And I held that august appointment for all of about 40 minutes. Whereupon our then permanent secretary heard about it and, as it was reported to me, said, "Give the boy a proper job." Well, needless to say, we have come a long way since then. We now have a specific directorate in the ministry, and not a small one either, devoted to the Middle East and North Africa. We have substantive political dialogues with several Middle Eastern and North African countries. We have joint commissions of various kinds with several Middle Eastern countries. We have free trade agreements with the GCC and Jordan. We started the Asia-Middle East dialogue. And while I will not ruin your digestion with dry statistics, I can say with confidence that our non-energy related economic ties with the Middle East are now far more broadly based, growing rapidly across a wide spectrum of fields, and hold great promise. Singapore is, of course, a very small place, a tiny speck on the map. And if it were only us, the story would not be one of any great significance or of anything more than parochial interest. But our engagement of the Middle East is only a tiny part of the far bigger and more important story of East Asia reconnecting with the Middle East and South Asia broadening and deepening its traditional engagements with the Middle East. And this bigger story is itself part of an even bigger story of a global recalibration of power and ideas. You know the story as well as I do, and I will not bore you by repeating what you already know about the East Asian growth story, China's enthusiastic embrace of capitalism, and India shaking off the shackles of the so-called license Raj, and the enormous pent-up energies that have been so released. It has become a cliche to say that this is changing the world, and so it is. But the manner in which the world is changing is at once more subtle and more challenging than I think is commonly perceived. And since these changes and challenges form the essential context of East Asia's engagement of the Middle East, as well as the inescapable environment within which the Middle East itself will evolve, I can perhaps best contribute to your discussions by sharing with you my ideas about these changes and how they could impact upon the Middle East. And so my theme is East Asia and the Middle East. And this also has the advantage of allowing me to sidestep the more obvious embarrassments of exposing my ignorance of the Middle East before such a learned audience. Of course, you know, as some of my friends here well know, I may well still embarrass myself, but at least it will be in other ways. First of all, let me say that the global changes that are underway cannot be understood by simplistic slogans such as, you know, Asia rising, the West declining. The changes in the global distribution of power are relative and not absolute. And more importantly, the complex interdependencies that are both the cause and consequence of these changes in the relative distribution of power cannot be reduced to simple dichotomies, whether geographically or otherwise defined. Of course, Chinese and Indian growth is real, just as Brazilian growth or Indonesian growth or South Korean growth is real. They are new facts. Of course, the US and Europe face enormous and serious economic challenges. These too are facts. But ask yourself a few questions. Where do the global production change still ultimately lead to? Where is the markets? Where is the market of last resort that drives global growth? And what really viable alternative is there yet to the US dollar as the international reserve currency, or to the US dollar as the denomination currency of choice for most international trade, particularly trade in energy? It's far easier to talk about global rebalancing than to do it. And this is not to say that global rebalancing is unnecessary. Long-term global macroeconomic and strategic stability depends on global rebalancing. That's obvious. But this is not just a matter of China appreciating the renminbi or stimulating its domestic economy, or of Americans and Europeans rediscovering the virtues of thrift. This is all very necessary and complicated enough. But what rebalancing really implies and requires is that these countries develop an entirely new socio-economic model that is both sustainable, economically sustainable, and politically saleable. And this will be an infinitely more complicated and painful enterprise, a work of not just a few years, but of decades. There is no guarantee that either liberal democracies or more authoritarian systems can bear the pain and stay the course. We are all entering into uncharted territory. We are, I believe, in what will prove to be a very long interregnum between the Western-defined international system of the last 200 years or so and what? No one really knows. There's been a lot of loose talk about multipolarity. I don't think this is yet a truly multipolar world, if by multipolarity we imply at least a rough parity between the poles. There is still a clear international hierarchy, albeit a somewhat flatter one, and the US is still at the top of the hierarchy in most dimensions of power. There is no international issue that can be adequately managed without, at least in some degree, the participation of the US. And yet, the clear lesson of the last decade, vividly illustrated by events in the Middle East, is that the US, for all its vast power, cannot go it alone. At the same time, and herein lies the complication and the subtlety of the new global situation, another clear lesson of the last decade, again vividly illustrated by events in the Middle East, is that in the post-Cold War world, there is no self-evident strategic imperative for other major powers to accept US leadership or even an American definition of the strategic challenges. Further, given its own economic difficulties, there is little appetite, at least in my judgment, there is little appetite among the American people to pay the price and bear the burdens of global leadership. Yet global leadership is necessary. There has also been a lot of talk about the global role of the BRICS, or now BRICS with a capital S, with an uppercase S, with the addition of South Africa to Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The BRICS are undoubtedly an important component of the new international equation. But I beg you not to forget that this acronym, BRICS, was coined by a fund manager as a marketing slogan intended to persuade the unwary from their money, to persuade the unwary to part with their money, and not as a geopolitical concept. And it's still not a self-evidently viable geopolitical concept. The BRICS have global interests. They have opinions on many global issues. But global interests and opinions do not in themselves a global power make. As a trading nation, Singapore too has global interests. And we are certainly not short of opinions in Singapore. But it would be laughable for us to think of ourselves as a global power, and not being mad, we do not do so. I'm not implying that the BRICS are in any way comparable to Singapore, but while the BRICS have the potential to become global powers, that we do not. At present and for the foreseeable future, the BRICS are all still primarily regional powers. The BRIC with the greatest global potential is China, and on this I'll speak a little bit more later. What about the EU? The EU undoubtedly has a global economic impact, and certainly of late, its economy is of grave global concern. But the EU's common foreign and security policy is still largely noble rhetoric and not a geopolitically relevant reality beyond its immediate environs. Further afield, the EU's strategic impact is either marginal or inconsequential. And even in its immediate neighborhood, let's not forget that 15 years or so ago, it was only the intervention of the US that pulled the EU's chestnuts out of the fires of the former Yugoslavia. And the EU's military and economic capabilities have significantly degraded since then. International institutions, whether established ones like those that are part of the UN system, or more recent innovations like the G20, are at best a partial solution to this deficit of global leadership. They play an important, indeed irreplaceable role in legitimizing global leadership by building consensus, but cannot substitute for global leadership because international institutions reflect the international distribution of power far more than they shape global power. The consequence of all this is, I think, thus will be, at least I think it will be, a prolonged period of, for want of a better word, I will call more than ordinary messiness in international relations during the long interregnum. Many urgent international issues, such as climate change, or food or energy security, or the management of scarce resources like water, or nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and elsewhere, or the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, will be, at best, suboptimally dealt with during this long interregnum. And this will be so even if there is an international consensus that these are common and urgent challenges. And this is not something to be taken for granted. It will not be so because to recognize a problem is not to solve it. The current situation in Libya provides a timely illustration of the challenges of this brave and messy new world. Set aside the question of whether military intervention was prudent or necessary. Let us accept that for whatever reason, domestic, humanitarian, or strategic, some countries thought that intervention was in their interests. Still, I must admit that when I first heard some European leaders talk of the need for a no-fly zone, I wondered why they found it necessary to so publicly confess that they had no planes to fly. I'm joking, of course, but it's only a partial joke because we all know it was only when the US reluctantly, and wisely reluctantly in my view, because it still has Iraq and Afghanistan in its hands, it's only when the US decided to weigh in that anything was and could be done. And the effort clearly cannot be sustained without US participation. The US has set clear limits to the depth of its engagement in Libya, and even if the US government would want to go further, would the American people stomach it? So what happens next? Perhaps in some days or weeks or months or a year or 2 or 3 or 4, one way or another, the kernel will be gone. And then the real challenges will begin. Who will meet them? Who can meet them? who will pay to meet them. I am not often glad that Singapore has no oil, but this is one of those occasions where gratitude for our resource deprivation seems appropriate. Ladies and gentlemen, I probably rambled on for too long, but before I conclude, I must say a few words about China and US-China relations as they relate to the Middle East. US-China relations are already the most important bilateral relationship in East Asia, and they set the tone for the entire region. When US-China relations are stable, East Asia is calm. But when US-China relations are roiled, the entire region is unsettled. And before too long, I predict, they will have a similar impact on every region of the world, including the Middle East. US-China relations are immensely complicated, and this is not the occasion to elaborate on the complexities. Suffice it for me to say that I do not think conflict is inevitable or even likely, but competition is an intrinsic part of any great power relationship. Cooperation, of course, coexists with competition in any relationship. But where will the balance between cooperation and competition be struck in the Middle East? China has global interests, but as I said earlier, global interests do not themselves a global power make. And for all its very long history, China has little experience of global affairs, and so has chosen to define its interests in the Middle East, as in Africa and Latin America, rather narrowly, primarily in economic terms and in particular in terms of access to oil and other resources. And the same you can say is true of India. There is nothing particularly unusual about this, as this is how most major powers define their primary interests in the Middle East. But I believe that in time China will find, as other major powers have found, often to their chagrin, that the nature of the dynamics of the Middle East will, whether they like it or not, whether they intend it or not, entangle them in the geopolitics of the Middle East. I see no reason why China or India should be exempt from this inexorable law of the Middle East. How then will the Middle East figure in US-China relations? What will be the impact on the Middle East? Well, I'm not clairvoyant, but I will venture to suggest that if we accept as the starting premise that the primary interests of both the US and China is access to oil and gas, and if consequently we accept that stability in the Middle East is a primary requisite for secure access to energy supplies, then a Martian or a Vulcan looking down on the Middle East from outer space with cold and clinical perfect rationality, dismissing all the ambient complexities of US-China relations as logical irrelevancies, must surely deduce that the US and China have a common interest in Middle East stability. Therefore, a Vulcan will conclude that some 21st century version of the Quincy Accord with China and the US explicitly or tacitly sharing the burdens of maintaining stability in the Middle East is entirely possible. And so there is no reason to be overly pessimistic. But of course, we are not Vulcans, but mere earthlings, subject to all the frailties and passions of humankind. Perfect objectivity and untainted logic is nowhere to be found this side of heaven. On earth, and perhaps in the Middle East in particular, 2 + 2 does not always add up to 4. And so there is no reason for being overly sanguine either. There are all too many ways to define stability with regard to issues such as Palestine or Iran, and the political transitions that are currently underway across the Middle East and North Africa greatly complicate the efforts of all major powers to define their interests in the Middle East, leading to the kinds of political gyrations and diplomatic contortions that are already evident. So I can only conclude that one way or another, US-China relations will have a major impact on the Middle East that only events can clarify. And it is for scholars like you to speculate on the probable direction of these events. And ladies and gentlemen, with that unabashedly diplomatic cop-out, I will end. But not before reminding you, as I must, that these, no doubt, eccentric opinions are my own only, and do not represent the views of anyone but other than myself, and I have shared them with you, as I have been assured, under Chatham House rules. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience.